I am live. I'm reading Vacation by Joan Marshall Grant. This is a book about her travels through France with Charles, her then husband, in 1946. It was published in 1947. Joan passed away in 1989, and she was very famous for her far memory books, which were books of her lives in the ancient Egypt and so on. Anyway, this is a travel book, mainly in France, and it's chapter 20, the PERNOT type. Our night in Saint-Étienne would have established Patver's claim to Irish descent if that had still been necessary, for it was pungent with improbability. The hotel had many rooms, but by some chance, the only private bathroom, in fact I think the only bath, was at our disposal. The bedroom on the 5th floor cannot have measured more than 8 feet by 9, most of it occupied by a feather bed on a frame of creaking iron. The bath itself had an elfin charm, being a small oval tub in which Charles sat, with his knees drawn up to his chin, curiously reminiscent of a Pear's soap advertisement in the Bubbles period. I explored 4 dingy corridors, but found only one door with the comforting 2-letter device. The outer door, which had no lock or bolt, opened into an anteroom, equipped only for masculine needs, so when in the father sanctuary one must either wait, marooned in modesty, or else walk out with a sang-froid which cannot be dismayed by déshabillé. It reminded me of an occasion when, younger and less bold, I had nearly been left behind in Athens, being too timid to run a similar gauntlet while the plane refueled on its way to Alexandria and Baghdad. Nothing could daunt us in our present mood, even when an appeal on the house telephone produced, after long delay, a pot of tea instead of the more sustaining liquid we had ordered. "The telephone works not very well," said the child who brought it, "but I told them my mother knows the habits of our good English friends. We have found tea for you." He hesitated, a little abashed at his brave display of instrumental knowledge. "I told them to use hot water." He poured out a cup of lukewarm fluid, the colour and taste of straw. He cannot have been a day older than 10, and as I thanked him, and as I drank it with the appreciation which would have honoured a great tea bouquet, his face went pink with pleasure. And the 500 francs I impulsively gave him afflicts further English visitor with tea, may they receive from it an equal warmth. We walked through the dingy streets, secure that Patver was with us, but Patver being the word for good luck really, for there was no sign of a restaurant, and we hurried with increasing hunger, for it was now nearly 9 o'clock. At last we saw a place which suggested a cafe rather than a source of steady munching, and were conducted to a table in the upstairs room by a patron deferential as a hired butler. Imitation beams, checked tablecloths, and peasant pottery were demure as a tea shop in Sussex, and while we were having coffee, a man came over to our table and asked if we, being English, would honour him by accepting a glass. Strands of black hair barred his glistening skull, decisive as the shadow of bars on a prison floor. Prominent grey eyes maintained an acute angle to each other, producing an expression of low cunning which would have gained him an immediate post as gunman Slaughter. His shoulders could have swung his considerable weight in pursuit of the most elusive gorilla. He was so clearly a monster that he aroused my protective instincts. On other occasions, my illogical recognition of an unlikely treasure has produced odd confidences, and this was in the finest tradition. Without preamble, he informed me that even at this moment his beloved wife was lying in a nursing home, having but yesterday suffered a grievous operation which required 3 hourly injections of a substance called penicillin, of which he had never heard. Charles reacted like a hound to the horn and gave him a heartening account of the excellent results which might be expected. He rallied enough to order another Pernot and pressed further cognacs upon us, but soon relapsed into sorrow. "It is worse, far worse than you imagine," he said. It appeared that he was not only distraught at the torments his dear wife suffered, a wife so beautiful and 20 years younger than he, but the question of his hideous complicity was driving him towards thoughts of razors self-applied to the throat. "Ah," I said to myself, "it is as I suspected, a treasure who has waited too long for a shoulder on which to unburden." I patted his hand to show that without fear he might tell me all. The result was more complete than I anticipated, for he had a fine sense of imagery, and no detail was slurred. Sufficient, perhaps, that early in the narrative I guessed the meaning of matrice. The judgment demanded was whether his wives had suffered from over-enthusiasm or her husband's ill fortune. While the confession was in full spate, he paused to address Charles. "Monsieur, why is it that I discover myself telling these things to your wife?" "Proceed without further anxiety," replied Charles with old-world courtesy. "It is a characteristic that these happenings occur with regularity, and without embarrassment to either party. But," he added, "as it is easier for 2 than 3 to talk from the heart, I will leave you together and wait in the bar below." I did what I could, which was not difficult, for he was completely disarmed by kindliness, and after about an hour we went downstairs to find Charles. I was still wondering whether my diagnosis, made on insufficient medical evidence, was correct, as I was probably a little absent-minded, when I engaged the patron with some trivial pleasantry. I noticed that he seemed oddly distrait, but ascribed this to some worry of his own, with which I could not, at the moment, concern myself. So I was surprised when Charles caught hold of me and swung me behind him. With a fine reverberation, the row of bar stools crashed to the floor. This avalanche had been brought about by the largest man I have yet seen. He bore a vast red beard and was fighting drunk. Clearly, he was being a nuisance, and Patverbe, for some obscure reason, impelled me to advance towards him, uttering a prissy rebuke suitable to a schoolteacher addressing Joan Minor, who has been detected throwing spitballs in class. The effect was dynamic. Apparently, from cracks in the floor, many little men arose, fell upon the giant with angry cries, and propelled him through the door like an outcast Gulliver. The barman, looking foolish, crept from behind the bar and began to sweep up the broken glass. Charles patted me on the shoulder. "Anyone would think you'd been born in a Wexford pub," he said proudly. I felt my hand seized and kissed. My treasure, shaking with Pernot and emotion, exclaimed, "Madame, if you are the variable spirit of Churchill, you say to the big one, 'Stop,' and he stops." He began to sob. But I was so afraid that I suffered a disaster. I tried to comfort him, but nothing would serve except that we went with him while he repaired this childish ravage. Charles whispered a mild protest, but I was determined. Le Pernot must not be snubbed, for no one else was likely to discover the gold beneath the suit. We followed him down narrow streets and ill-lit alleys until he opened a door. A lady in a soiled pink wrapper, trimmed with a classic marabout, greeted us warmly. Le PERNOT explained that we were his guests, whom he left in her care while he attended a certain urgent affair. She was so motherly that Charles was unaware that this was more than a new kind of bar. Le PERNOT returned in another suit and came back to our hotel. From an inner pocket he drew out a British passport, dated 1908. The yellow photograph showed him with a quiff and a pearl tie-pin, but it was obviously the same man. I have not been worthy of my British nationality, he said with maudlin remorse. I am, if you will understand, not actually of your blood, but my mother went for a week to an aunt in Soho. The channel was rough and I was born. For a moment he sounded more cheerful. The stupidity of the Germans is incredible. I hid this passport and they never suspected I was British. His voice rang out so loud that I was relieved we were the sole occupants of the lounge. From now onwards, I shall never forget I'm English. Somehow, I shall learn what you have taught me. The wonderful unreasonableness which never lets you see the battle is impossible until you have won it. This seemed the moment to say good night, but he sat on and on, telling us the ropes by which we could have found our way through the labyrinth of the blackest markets. He even gave us a detailed tariff for crimes, and seemed a little dashed that there was nothing we wished arranged. As we lay, we gently set him on his way and went upstairs. At last, we gently set him on his way and went upstairs. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, but for some reason neither of us felt sleepy. We talked until interrupted by a furious knocking. I leapt out of the feather bed, for Charles was against the wall, seized the dressing gown and opened the door. A small Frenchman, whom I had first mistook for a troll, was hopping with rage on the mat. He had a straggly beard, and his flannel nightshirt displayed thin, hairy legs that ended in unnaturally large bare feet. The theme of his remarks was that he loathed foreigners, and especially those who woke him in the night. I apologized with sufficient seriousness and managed to shut the door before I dissolved into helpless laughter. With a bag of feathers, which served as an eiderdown over our heads, we talked in whispers, feeling as though a governess were lurking to add another item to our childish sins. So this was the PERNOT type. Now the next chapter is Jacques Coeur. Jacques of the Heart. Anyway, it's chapter 31. Have a lovely Thursday, the 16th of January, 2025.